personnes en pause, en pré-café. Je ne sais pas si je fais un appel parce qu'en même temps vous êtes là et il ne faut pas que ça soit diffusé dans l'autre salle. Alors quelle heure est-il? Oui, on va commencer puisqu'il est 9h30 et...
So I guess it's time to start. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. According to the program, we're supposed to start at 9:15. We're going to present you today a session as to people, garden cities for the 21st century. Frederic Alexander is not here today, so my name is Bernard Blanchon in landscaping, and Sébastien Jacot teaching geography in University of Paris 1, the Sorbonne. It's a pleasure to talk about living garden cities is the subject today, and as fact seems a subject that has not been published so much or studied, or communication that we did receive, because we called people, because garden cities were conceived as an inhabited neighborhood in public and private tree-lined spaces designed a space for social and shared life. Few publications were done compared to this present. The ideological, urbanistic, and architectural genesis of these complexes in line with this observation for call of application of the colloquium. We didn't have so many presentations. Who lives in a city, garden city? Because many people talked yesterday, today, tomorrow. We are asking ourselves who lives there, what is its history, and we have different status of employers' garden cities that are more mistrust, especially among unionized workers, while natalist ideologies could govern the section and monitoring of the inhabitants in the city. Ungermach in Strasbourg. Since then, garden cities had changes of the last 100 years, and there has been rehabilitation in many garden cities. Some of them became more bourgeois, changed their status, and it's not only a question of gentrification or the transformation of the long term of the settlement can lead to an idealistic of the original social life. Some of these garden cities become difficult social conditions because of the diminution of the people living there. There's always the question, who is living in these garden settings? What kind of dynamic, what evolutions? Is it something that is that you choose, or that you suffer and follow? Is it a single family? Or do you believe you can stay there, or is it just part of your life? Management of these garden cities and the study of lifestyles makes it possible to define the intensity of the inhabitants' attachment, which was according to life paths, usage patterns, relationship aspirations, maintaining a home in the city when your family is growing or the composition is changing. It's in some cases exogenic arrangements that ask you to stay or to move. There are certain habits and links that can be created, and the different states. You can be owner, co-owner, renting, attached to the architectural landscape, urbanistic or social dimension. It can be changed by urban plans, reconstruction changes, or changes of the inhabitants on the social scale. For example, we had these examples on the values of the Butte Rouge. This attachment is connected to the quality of the spaces themselves, and the second change is the social change. Because these cities do they change sociability or the way people communicate one with others, and be aware that it could be just ideas and making things more ideal than they are because of the common spaces of the city gardens. It has been mentioned several times because there are no fences, or you create fences, and there is a question concerning the urban-rural divide, proposing housing of equivalent quality in urban gardens in rural localities or garden districts of the outskirts of an existing towns. So you can have not only the landscape, sharing agricultural, social, and other projects so that the users could be different. Inhabitants can play a very important role for the vegetation and for different qualities depending on the space. You can committees, you can have associations, and you can shade tourism, agriculture, other projects or events concerning the past that could be done to keep memory and lifestyle of local inhabitants. The third aspect is a modus vivendi, that you can have the different lifestyles concerning the areas to understand the way that the inhabitants are linked to the city garden. You mentioned that already. The questions of how long are you already living there, and if there are any consequences. Heritage is important to see how much people are linked and know their heritage. Has been mentioned yesterday, for which reasons, which values, why do people keep these values, what is the percentage of social life, of urban landscapes, and we understand as well the wishes of the evolution of the expectations, evolutions of the population, but as well how they are constrained towards the awareness of their social composition, management methods that are used either by the landlord or by their own organization concerning the dwelling. Vegetal questions are also important for diversity and for ways of managing regionally the social housing allocation. Maintenance is a question as well. Finally, what is the place that the actors that are important for keeping in life these garden cities towards the people living there, and how much does the population play an important role for the patrimony? So our idea is ask the usage, ask the goal, create places where one can live and have a good life quality, appreciating knowing their knowledge, knowing their history. The transformation can give rise to mobilization, as described by the Bout Rouge or other areas, and play an important role together, either on the national or the local level with associations. And I would insist to two dimensions that are linked with the identity of a garden city. One is the social dimension, and the other is the vegetal dimension, which are today evolving, and there's a whole discussion because people wonder what happens with the ecological transition and the social transition, what is life quality, and inhabitants appear to be actors in the conservation and transformation of these spaces, whatever the status is, through the micro arrangements they make, but also through their practices and usages. So one tries to see what is the vision of the inhabitants and how they can behave in their garden cities and treat them as a heritage and the community ideal. And we will now have the presentations because you can find the text of Sarah Roux in Limoges. Within the book you can find Jean Franco Parent could not come here either, So we're going to have two sessions of two presentations each time, with round tables with the person in charge of Habitat de France. All these contributions are very different from Germany, Belgium, Spain, France, Tanzania. We also have people who work in research in different areas, people that work as architects or landscape artists. So you can see a whole project is to show the diversity of different approaches to the city gardens, to show how much we can become richer through this diversity and exchange ideas and ask the questions of But Rouge, for example, that we had already yesterday. So this was a basic idea when we started with the book, and exchange our ideas. So we'll have a discussion. So I will start by inviting Richard Nordier, who is in charge as a sociologist and urban planner, and Francesco De Vitro, who is a teacher, researcher in environmental geography in the University of Tours. So this will be the two first presentations, and please do sit here. Good morning, everybody. I work for Lyonnaise area. I don't know if you know this kind of structure. We're an association that accompany local authorities in their policy, and we create studies on different subjects that could be concerning the public agents. Today I will present you a work that I made with a colleague of mine who is not here today. It's a common work, and we wrote together the article. Judith Poulard, and I'm sure that will remind you lots of ideas that we had already yesterday. But I would like to add an important precision that the study I'm going to present you has started before COVID crisis. We continued as far as we could during the COVID crisis. In the beginning, we had the ambition to give another dimension with a lot of participation, with exchange with people living in those cities, and I hope soon we'll be able to get people to talk back with us. But we had two elections since then, and I cannot tell you everything because some of the elements depend from our cities that spent time. But I'm going to say a lot of things, but not everything. Let's start. A few elements of the context. I'll bring you in the east of the city of Lyon in an area called Vomvle. This part of the territory became urban very late because it was swamps, and there were lots of inundations and recurrent floods in the 19th century, and they created a channel, a hydroelectric plant to ease the east of Lyon. This is how they became a more, let's call it, dry area, and started to be more urban and started to be more active. They had activities linked with silk that left to the east of the city and used these new territories. Within the actors, there was a family called Gilet, which is a very important family for silk. They decided to work with artificial silk and viscose. They created a factory called TAS. TAS means artificial textile of Southeast, TASE. This industrial complex combining factories, houses and facilities. It was in the 1920. It was created on agricultural land pieces, and the city of Taz was a worker city with a double importance because there was a big city and a small city was designed of housing estate that are only social houses as of today, and the small city Taz is pavilions, and I'm going to tell you about this garden city where it was composed of 88 houses. It's comprising different dwellings deserving employees. All the other areas of metropolis of Lyon had a very active industrial evolution all the 20th century. It's an area that is still today the most important industrial area of France. Activity will be very important till 1976, where we will discover that industry will leave Lyon. You will see factories closing and production going abroad. So this will lead to the public authorities to have new projects for the usage of these territories. And in that part of the city, you'll have a project that's called Carré des Soies, that means a square of silk. And this project starts in 2007, and they will change by having metro and tramway arriving there, a shopping mall and shopping center, offices, lodging, and it's a very active evolution of the development of evolution. And this little city is at the board of this area. This transformation that is underway shows as well that there are new citizens that move in this industrial area, and we will soon start with the civil actors that will have many initiatives to protect, defend life and memory that is all around this whole application, with different consequences of changing the presentation of Carré des Soies, which is not as dense as it has been initially planned. So we will have Esprit des Lieux. It's another project of the metropolis of Lyon. Slide. Okay.
So I'm going to talk to you about the Petit Taz, an urban oasis. It's a part of the Cité Taz. It's really an urban oasis. Classically, it is an ensemble that is both a production site and housing and equipment. We saw this yesterday. Now, in this small area, there's a diverse population. There are workers, a number of workers, and engineers and foremen. The social diversity is also translated into who gets the different types of housing. They're attributed to various types of employees. The Petite Cité Taz was intended for well-deserving people, and the houses were for people that deserved more than others. It's what everybody said yesterday. This is very interesting, as is the case of all of the cities. It's a city that groups together 88 houses, which is quite big. These 88 houses use 13 different architectural models, which is quite unusual. They have from 1 to 6 housing units. So these are big houses that were for engineers, and others that have 6 housing, which are more modest. Those are housing for workers. What's important is that every housing unit, whatever the type, benefited from a garden. Every house had its own garden for the occupants. From the urban point of view, the Petit Taz was built around an area that was very sophisticated. There was a lot of curving with a lot of vegetation, which it was a kind of a bucolic atmosphere, very charming. It's hard to resist the charm of this cités. And some associations, it was a very unusual sound ambience. They have a very imposing front. It's kind of an acoustic barrier, in fact, to create that interesting ambience. Cités was the initiative on the part of bosses. This is not social housing. It was built to house workers, and which would be the case up to the 80s. In the 80s, when they closed the plant, the housing was sold, priority basis to the current occupants and to social financing. And today, the house belonged almost exclusively to individual owners. This was a very important transformation because we're moving all of a sudden from a system that was managed by one single contact, point of contact, to a parcellated ownership, and to ownerships that are managed individually without necessarily any coordination. So the city's going to be considerably transformed in its form and also in its utilization, because they're going to have people that make some transformations as well. So, our study was born from the request of the collective people. They wanted us to help them in the study to get to know the neighborhood better, morphologically and sociologically. Now, the collectivity wanted to know how it was transformed. This was born of empirical knowledge, but we don't really know why. What's happening inside the housing units and even in the gardens, because in gardens they're also partly hidden by palisades, and it's sometimes hard to see them from the street. And so also there's sociological interrogations as well, as was spoken about yesterday, based on gentrification of city gardens and the change in the type of population. So how do we manage to respond to this request? Well, we put together a multidisciplinary team to work on these different aspects. Judy Toff, who's not here today, was a specialist, and she was specialized in sociology, and she asked for some help in the urban aspects. So this was formed by young urbanists, and we have a student workshop which worked as well with us, piloted by Stephanie Vincent. We worked in 4 levels. First of all, we identified and met all of the stakeholders, the various city services, were the urbanism, the architects of the French buildings, the associations, because there were several associations that were present and that had different initiatives in this sector. We met them to collect their points of view, to see what their level of knowledge was of the city and what was at stake and what proposals they were willing to make. And then we developed a questionnaire that we sent out to all of the inhabitants. And they asked us really to get into contact with all of the inhabitants in the cités, and that's why we developed a partnership with the urbanists, because we had to knock literally on every door of 88 homes. Sometimes the doors weren't open, so we met a lot of people. And in parallel, we also ran a whole series of interviews at home with the inhabitants, and Manon de Boost handled that. These are people that are so kind to receive us in their homes in the evening sometimes, to devote some time to have us visit their homes and to see how they arrived there, for how long they've been there. There are people that sometimes we just give them a camera to ask them to take some pictures of whatever they think of interest in their housing, and to show what they've changed and so forth. And then we also carried out benchmarks. we looked at what was being done elsewhere in terms of development of garden cities, depending on the mobilization of the inhabitants. How do you get people in the loop to develop the value of such neighborhoods? So what came out of our study? The first important point is that there was a real questioning of the community to see whether people that were gravitating around that neighborhood, whether there's a real awareness of the garden city, and to know what a garden city is. So the first level is, the answer is yes. Everybody is aware of the heritage value of the district among the resource actors. We met only inhabitants, but then we're going to see that the reading depends on what point is involved in the question. There are resource actors, institutionals, professionals, specialists. Everybody agrees to recognize the architectural quality and the landscape quality, and which is there are a lot of garden cities in the Rhône-Alpes. Is an industrial area where there are a lot of, but these are distinguished from others because there's a huge difference in morphology and architecture. So that's an important consensus. Everybody agrees we need to preserve this singularity. But there's some nuances in the different resource actors on the way to reconcile preservation of the building and what you can call lifestyle and the transformations that people want to make to their housing. And that's where there are some divergences. One part of the resource actors consider that preservation of the building needs to be more important than the lifestyle. What does that mean? It means to prohibit building garages or Velux windows. Other resource actors have a more practical aspect that maybe you should start from the needs of inhabitants to try to redefine the rules. And in the midst of those, there are people that have an intermediary position. And in terms of the inhabitants, just 2 minutes. In terms of the inhabitants, there's a strong heritage awareness among the inhabitants. But there's a nuance here as well, because which was identified in our questionnaire. We realized that these differed according to how long they'd been living in the neighborhood. We didn't actually do a census. We realized that there was a big social mix. Sometimes there were people that had actually worked in the plants, or the children of said people, and there are people that are new arrivals, and that was more a movement of gentrification, which is not massive, but it is nonetheless there, and that's important. We realized that the inhabitants that had been there for a long time were very attached to the whole heritage aspect, but from an immaterial point of view. In other words, everything having to do with relationships with neighbors, values coming out of the workers' world. As soon as you ask them to talk about the petitas, there's a whole series of anecdotes and slices of life having to do with relationships with other people in the neighborhood, and that's really what is important for them in the future. Whereas the new arrivals, people that have been there more recently, are often people with more degrees and more money. You can imagine. It's near the metro and so forth. It's actually quite valuable real estate. These are people that are much more sensitive to the material aspects of the heritage. In other words, the form of it, the materials used, the design of windows, the color of the facade. These are people that try to respect this in the innovation they want to involve, but there are different problems and different points of tension. So we're able to see that there's a real need for clarification of the rules, and both professionally and on the part of individuals, because for 20 years, a whole series of interventions and expertise and studies that were run by different technical services, and the contacts have changed over time. So there's a whole kind of fuzzy context, and people no longer know what they should do or shouldn't do. So here's our conclusion. So what do we recommend? Our conclusion is that there's a real need for mediation and consultation. The logement housing was transformed, sometimes good, sometimes not so good. Not everybody knows the rules, not everybody understands the rules. Everybody thinks they're doing the right thing, but they don't have the right reading. you don't realize that the idea, people don't understand, renewal, renovation through identical reproduction doesn't mean the same thing for everybody. There are events, there's mediation, accompaniment, and various stakeholders working on the regulatory aspect, getting people to know rules, what we have the right to do or not to do, and then the financial support. Because they're part of the people are the original inhabitants, and they don't have much revenue. And works on renovation and bumping their quality up to standards is important, and they don't necessarily have the financial resources to do so. And the last point, I'm going to skip over some pictures which are nonetheless quite interesting to see. This garden city is really interesting. There are others in these geographical area, and we can see that many city gardens have as much interest. We really believe that this is a model that can be a source of inspiration for the future. And various lockdowns have shown to what extent the French were attached to their individual home while still having a particular attention to the social aspects of the neighborhood. And this type of garden city lends itself well to this. And another thing is that the future, this is a heritage whose future will not be achieved by putting it under a bell, but rather by an inclusive and participatory approach that places the participatory approach that places the resident and user at the heart of reflections and actions. How do you reconcile the changes that are going to be made to the home and the garden to preserve the original quality of the city? Thank you. We're going to move on to the second speaker, Francesco De Vitro from the University of Tours. Hi, everyone. I'm going to try to It's roughly 15 minutes. Does this work? How can I... Very well. So, the starting point for this research that I'm going to be talking to you about is the question of nature in the city. And nature in the city today is recognized as really, the proximity with nature is recognized as a real human need, which is indispensable. And we can recognize that in our cities, natural spaces and green spaces are not really considered to be an infrastructure, an urban infrastructure in the same way as the others, in particular in popular neighborhoods. So the question can arise in garden cities. It was from the beginning of the 20th century, can garden cities suggest ways forward so that this need to have green areas can be satisfied? Can we orientate? In other words, can we say something here about the way you design a city that would respond to the real needs for nature, especially for popular? So we did this research on vegetation, garden cities, and with two aspects, a really botanical aspect. We looked at what species there were, botanically speaking, and can this vegetation contribute to biodiversity, and can it be a support for education to the environment for people in these areas? And what's the experience of people about this? How do they use it? How do they respond? And how do they consider all of this? So we worked on 5 garden cities, and all of the city gardens in Tours. It's an average-sized city, which is a bit emblematic of worker gardens. It's a kind of gardening which is a bit contemporary. It's the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century. We worked on all of the cités-jardins in Tours. More precisely, This is a city that belonged to the owners, but it had the same form. So it was organized based on around a green area, and the city garden as such that was built by the HLM office at the time, which is still there today and taking care of social housing. As you can see, it may not very visible, but you can see this in the map on the top right-hand corner. This is the most central, and the four others, which are kind of around that center between La Richère, the departments, the cités-jardins, or the city gardens. So this is the end of the 19th century, and the two western areas were from the 1920s, and you can see what you see on the map is from the 30s, 1930s. So first of all, let's get rid of the question of the clos. These are intermediary spaces between the central space and the private areas, which are characteristic of this type of arrangement. And the closed areas are spaces that are totally tarred over today, which are used as parking lots. There's not necessarily an access of vehicles, though, but in no case are they areas that could be green spaces. And so they're not areas where you can have biodiversity or contributing to well-being. No, they're just tarred. Our study had to do mainly with the vegetal space, plants with vegetation around the central public space. There are two important areas: the public space of the central square, which is kind of the symbol of this area. The theory of the city gardens were the popular common around which all of these housing units were located, and private gardens, which are kind of usually behind the houses or around the houses. So the botanical study was not done in private housing. We did not look at the species that were being grown there, but we did in the central common. So if we did a study in the way the GIS, the Geographical Information System, the share of the area devoted to the central square or the central common and the average surface area, it is the vegetation spaces are the most variable. And the space devoted to housing and roads, and including the closed-off tarred areas, what changes a lot is, in fact, the share allotted to private gardens, where, getting back to the common, the central place, and this symbol, really, of the city garden, this kind of a tacit classical model in all of these squares, even though that did change sometimes, is stabilized central common, stabilized soil with large trees for shade. Often there are games. They play bocce. So this is the general model that we saw time and again. In some areas, the city gardens had evolved. Sometimes it was a model that was totally upset, but you can really feel that there is this kind of reference on the common. To get back to the changes, indeed, we do regret that we weren't able to find in the archives, the municipal archives, in the departmental, or even in the archives of the HLM office, which today manages 4 of the 5 cities, to not have found written traces of projects and modifications of the central common. We were able to put some things together over time, looking at photographs and aerial photographs, and by asking questions of inhabitants. So there are 3 main types of modifications. There were modifications having to do with vegetation. Sometimes there was just a simplification of vegetation. For example, for the Boss city, they got rid of massive planted areas, and they would replace fruit species by ornamental species. And generally, there's a simplification, there's a big diversification. In some cases, municipalities just upset the initial model of the central common with trees, and is by using a bigger variety. There's one case where the initial project was never happened. It's present in the project, but the pictures from the 40s don't look like the vegetation planned. So it was always a parking lot. There are two other changes that we've observed. The question of parking. Now, the development of parking lots, either using the central common or near the common, and in some cases using family gardens, and they have sometimes some collective housing units as well. So the botanical study shows, in terms of the herbaceous species, are between 40 and 50, between 40 and 65. This is the biggest possibility for spontaneous, so we found very different herbaceous species, and it's quite rich. However, there's almost no small trees, and when they exist, they're planted. And there's only one case. We found one species that grew spontaneously. So this herbaceous species was quite significant in this one area. And there's also a certain poverty in terms of there's one species often, one species of tree. And that's kind of the model that I spoke about earlier. There's one type of tree in stabilized soil without any transition. So there's nothing specific to city gardens. Most urban areas look like that. They're lacking this intermediate step. I'm not going to insist on that. We don't have too much of time for that, but you can see that there are two major types. If we look at the square that was developed recently, about 15 years ago, there are two types of models. Either you have vegetation, which is spontaneous. It's interesting from the point of view of urban diversity, but it's kind of poor because it's not being taken care of. Or it's very rich and very diversified. Very rich and very well maintained, but ornamental. So there's not much potential for welcoming biodiversity. It's as though you couldn't have both a certain amount of, leaving some spontaneous vegetation while still having a certain richness and maintenance of that species. One thing I forgot to mention that's worth mentioning, there are also vegetation around the actual trees. And these are either herbaceous or shrubs, and that's quite diversified, and it's quite interesting. So I'm going to move quickly. I only have 5 minutes left. Now, what about inhabitants and usages? So how do they use the central common? So we ran semi-directed interviews with an interview grid based on the central common, the use of private gardens, and on the preference in terms of the green spaces, or the need or the interest of having urban green spaces. There were several questions, but it was basically on these three areas. So our respondents, there were 40 interviews from 7 to 9 per city. This is a sampling of population. We can't say that it was a representative sampling. It's an example. These are people that accepted to respond to us, that we met around the central common, or we met in their homes, and that welcomed us into their gardens. So half of the people, half of the respondents were, three-quarters of them were women, average age 56. They were usually tenants, and these are social housing. there were several people who actually had bought their property, but generally these are popular neighborhoods. These are workers or employees, or they work in the building industry, or they do they help people often there's a one person, on an average one person per housing unit, and they're usually stable people who stay there for a long time. We can get back to this later when we talk about the number of persons per housing unit. This used to be cities that were very numerous families, but maximum they're type 3. So there aren't many inhabitants per housing unit. A little bit more than half of these units use the central common. These are generally people that have children or pets, or some in the city that had collective housing. It's because it's nice to be able to have a place to meet your neighbors and have a chat. So these are not areas where you do sports. The typical types of activity in the green spaces, in these areas they don't do sport because they're too small to have a sporting activity here. So we have run some statistics. The usages are not in relationship with age, age-related or professional-related. It can be said that there's mainly in the city that they have collective housing, which with a larger number of people using the central common. And we also, there's a relationship that people have an alternative relationship with the private gardens. And the city that had the biggest number of private gardens also had the smallest use of the common. So that was their kind of alternatives.
For private gardens, it's more gardens for pleasure, but even 25 of them are used another garden, not only this private garden, either a walker garden or something else like having the possibility of a vegetable garden. The last information about the central place, you see it's a space that is used, let's say, people imagine themselves with a different desire of changing. Some want more vegetation, richer, more maintained, more invested from the landlord or from municipality. Otherwise, the people would like to use it in a different way. They want vegetation, but as well as place for leisure, for playing, for petanque balls, or for parking, or there is a competition between the different users because many people want parking lots, and in many areas they have known a project of reorganization of the central square that they optimize the space to create more available space for parking lots. And the only site among them that did not have that kind of project, you see that people ask for more parking lots, even if they would have to reduce the central place. Generally speaking, people enjoy living in these garden cities for reasons because of the feeling of calm, having the central square. They like it. It's something I appreciated. And they have an atmosphere, an environment that is very pleasant. There's association, they pay a low rent, which is very much appreciated. And another thing that has been said by the people is these are individual houses or apartments with a garden that are within a city or pericentral area, which is a great advantage of having access to different services, and it's an advantage for people living there. To come to my conclusion, it's obvious that there is a request of nature close by, having vegetation strata, even if people wouldn't use the central square because they don't have domestic animals or kids. They want to have this green space, but we can also realize, and I'm sure not everybody will love it, is that city garden, it's an insufficient answer to the need of green area. On one side, because the green space is insufficient. There's not enough vegetation, poor maintenance vegetation is insufficient. Highly maintained and ornamental vegetation seems to be common in small urban spaces, and people would like more parking lots, and they would prefer to have their own individual gardens. So my conclusion would be that the city garden is a very limited answer to satisfy the inhabitants, that can be inspiring, but when you have the right to life and the right to nature in a city, it's too weak, insufficient to answer to the needs of the people. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Since the next speaker is not here, let's start talking with the floor. And there's going to be a microphone. Please always use it so that everybody can hear you. Congratulations for the work that has been done on Guélan. I would love to be able to do the same thing at my garden city. I have two questions. As an archivist, I believe that you ask yourself how to keep the documentation that you created with your studies, with your interviews. And I do agree with your conclusion that a city garden is, first of all, a garden and then a home. Did you get any feedback from people that would like to be ambassadors and help city gardens being discovered to their neighbors? For archives, all the works are communicated to the documentation center of the city and to our partners. They keep all the documentations that we do as a result of our studies. So we have a lot of documentation. We kept the pictures that had been communicated by the people, the minutes, the statistics. Most of the documentation has been kept. Interviews were recorded, but we didn't keep the recordings. I'm not going to talk about method, but if you have a survey, you will keep the information, and you have a different approach if you work on memory and you transcribe everything. I think it was done by associations that supported us, and we all together created the text. For the ambassadors, we do have several associations that are active in our areas, and the members are locals. Usually, these are associations that include professionals. Some people don't work there, they're in link with this area because they work there, but not all the members are from local inhabitants. There are also offers of going for a walk in the neighborhood. We work with a metropole that coordinates coordination, inquires, surveys with many different ways of communicating with the inhabitants. I don't remember that cités-jardins participated in this one, but we had the days of the patrimony with the open days and visits of specific homes. It's not on a big scale, it's on a local scale. We didn't hear the question. The answer is no, we didn't ask this kind of question. Another question. Thank you. Maybe I would like to ask my question in English.
Oui, oui, oui. Alors, I would like to address my question to the last presenter, which is what lessons can we draw for the future eco-quartier, which we see both in France and England are very heavily dependent on intensive and very detailed landscaping, from the lesson of the garden cities which have been so poorly maintained. What mechanisms of management can we build in for the future so that this doesn't happen again?
I will answer in French. We see very clearly that there are different elements in your question. First of all, the initial design and planification, and then the gestion and the management of nature. The second part of managing nature, it's obvious that we would need to be more careful, and it's not only a question of horticulture intensive or poor treatment of the vegetation and of the plants. How would I say, to control vegetation? We should leave the possibility that vegetation could be spontaneous and will get developed. But if you have this spontaneity, you must maintain, you must do things in a more intensive way, in a more differentiated way. So often we have abandoned these spaces that does not leave vegetation to grow, because abandoning things Hope, elle a perdu le micro. Sorry. The usage done that are active. You have, for example, the composition of the soil that is not of good quality, and this way of abandoning does not allow to people or to natural vegetation to grow. It's not a spontaneous, interesting way for inhabitants. Or you just have trees, rose trees, for example. It's a very artificial. It should be very careful to allow spontaneous growth and not only having a gardener. You have to find a middle way. Hello. It's a witness statement, actually, that I would like to say. I know the character of cités-jardins that I have studied in examples that have been presented. I work in Poitiers, in the National Park of Seine-Normande, and cités-jardins of Trey. I have studied it, and we are lucky in our city garden to have important documentation, because the CAP has now all the archives that otherwise would have been thrown away, that came from the company that was created when ownership changed. And we have a very exact information and design of how these private gardens have been created, maintained, and we have very precise information of the evolution of those gardens. And when we walked on that city garden, we have within the park oral collection of information. We get inventories of what happens in our gardens on the way nature in the cities evolves. So we had a sample of people that we met, we interviewed, and somebody that had a prize of eco gardening. He was the winner of the prize, and in this city garden there was a lot of exchange between people living there and doing their gardening, either in public areas or private gardening, or in workers' gardening, because the workers' gardening exists with an association that is still active as of today, allowing people to participate on competitions where you have a winner and you have prizes for the winner. So from the beginning, we encourage doing own gardening in our city garden in Vantes, and that we had a professional gardener that would maintain part of the parks, of the villas, of the engineers, and of the city vegetation. So I do understand that these interventions are important and correspond to my own experience. What are the expectations of the inhabitants for nature in the city? It's only a question of space or being able to see the vegetation, and the expectations change depending of how big parks are in vicinity. Maybe it's an interesting question. We ask the question of what people prefer. We ask two questions. Do you want a green area that is where you often go, not only the small square in the central, and what is the natural milieu that we prefer? Honestly, the people like green areas close by. Perception is different because you are in a rink nearby where you have green spaces that are not very far away. No, we did not realize, didn't identify difference of perception or representation or request of social request depending of the distance to these green spaces. There's not such a big diversity. You have a ring around that part of the city, or you have a park, and it's not very close, it's not very far away. It's intermediate spaces. But one thing is for sure, people want nature, even by those that don't go to the central square. Even if they say that they never go, they regret that there is no story, no exchange, and no way to don't have this friendliness or this usability. My name is Convali. I'm coming from Suresnes. I live here in the cités-jardins. And thank you very much for your intervention. We feel the same thing in the city garden of Suresnes as you have described. And I do believe that all the works that have been done from all the speakers, actually, I hope it will go to the elected mayors. It's a question of political support that we do need. Politicians must know that inhabitants want to do things. Offices and institutions have their role to play, but in the ecological evolution, green spaces have their responsibility. So I hope the mayor will read the results of this symposium and with us as well, because it's very interesting, all the things we can do. My comment would go towards your last comments on cars, vehicles. You have the buildings. I have a different approach than the lady, that the inhabitants are the most important things. Everybody is important. The buildings are important. And we see that the buildings are getting old. and they need renovation in Suren and in other areas. It's a problem compared to the thermic insulation, for example. But we want to have our green spaces. It's essential part of our everyday life. But in Suren, we have good buildings, but green spaces are not maintained in the same quality. I'm trying to say it's not historical monuments, because historical monuments are protected, but green spaces are not protected. Yeah, Suren has a particularity of being remarkable green spaces, and we have a label. And they're nice buildings and pavilions. But there was a question that they use green spaces to have parking lots, so we lost half of our green space because of these cars. So maybe there's a proposition. Why don't we do different kind of parkings? It's a question of political will. I know money can be given or not given, but we could have parking lots under the level of the earth, underground. Yes, of course. Yes, parking lots, I do understand. I believe it should be resolved in another way, or could be solved in other ways, because there are not enough parking lots. It's a real problem for people living there, and it's not because they have 2 or 3 cars, each one of them, or each family. I do agree with you, underground would be a solution. There are projects where municipality tried to optimize space, to create space for parking lots without reducing the central square. Sometimes it works out well, but in other situations it's not possible. I do agree. Underground could be a solution. I will react to the relationship to nature and the cars. In our region, it's difficult to understand what people want to do with nature according to how they use their own gardens, because their own gardens are small, the apartments are small, and garden is an extension of your home, and people that come to live in the so-called petit étage, they love the possibility of being near nature. So very often in their garden they will have usages and activities they cannot do at home. Many people park their cars in their garden. But another comment of Mike. And we do understand the question of putting the car in your garden. You use your space. And there's another problem. There are so many alleys, and people will park their cars in the alleys, and that has consequences because you lose part of the pathways, and very often it becomes a parking of people that work nearby, and there's no cheap parking or free parking of people that park there because they're using the metro, they're taking the metro to go to the city, and so the usage of surface is complicated to manage. I think there's one last question before the break. Hello, and thank you very much. I work for the City Hall of Argenteuil, and my questions will be much more asking Mr. Nordier and the benchmarking that you have done. City gardens are in specific zones recognized having pavilions and the rules might be more complex when you only have pavilions. In nature on the city, you said it's insufficient as a surface, even in city gardens. I saw the slides that we have 20% of the space is green space of level, and the International Health Organization says less is enough. Is it a question of how much space is necessary in order to have a healthy life? And I will have a comment. For zoning, we didn't include that in our benchmarking. Our benchmark is concentrated how to give more value to city gardens, including the opinions and the mobilization of the inhabitants, how to keep them and give them more value. We know that reglementation varies from one territory to another. A comment for Taza City Garden. We are architects. There's a small book called The Gardens of Sunday, of Paola Pigiani, I believe, the writer. And it describes the city and the factory from 1829, where the factory of Taz would invite workers from all over Europe, Poland, Hungary, and Italians to work there. They have been hired in the factory, and it says the story of these workers that arrived at the end of the 80s and the 30s, their relationship with the pavilions, the different homes, social housing, and the relationship with the city that was quite far away. In their everyday life, they were separated with the city and the relationship with cars. Sundays, they would go to the river to dance, to enjoy life, have fun, and meet other people in the community. It's a very small book, very well written. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you. Thank you. I didn't say it. It's a fact of the development of TAS was accompanied by immigration, because these initiatives of employers would go to other countries to bring people. And we have minorities coming from different countries, Italy, Portugal, that are still there, second and third generation immigrants. Concerning the dimension of the percentage of the World Health Organization, I believe it's still a problem, because even if they pretend World Health Organization says we need so much surface of green space, but people want more green space. It's maybe linked to the fact that we don't maintain enough our green spaces. Maybe I could add a comment. It's another approach of the inhabitants of city gardens. We had interviews and we spoke with the archives. From the beginning, these people had not been always living because they were workers, because workers were often living in a slum or social housing. These city gardens were more for the people in charge. You mentioned the city of workers that had a merit. It was paternalism approach. The people that were the best workers, or the team managers, or the floor managers could have an apartment over there. It was not the workers. The workers would be in the slums. HLM had these dwellings for a stable population, people that would have a long-term contract or employees for police. It was not the workers, but it was civil servants living in these better conditions. Thank you for this additional information. And in Surin newspaper, we have some comments from a journalist. I would like to ask for Surin. City gardens are part of a list of remarkable gardens, and the whole site is protected. So when asking ourselves what can we do with cars, it's a real challenge, because if you look on all postcards in the 20s, there were not so many cars. There was sometimes only one car per family, and there is a parking in front of the church that is insufficient, and it's complicated, and I believe we should always evolve, because of the city garden needs to be adapted to our days and to the request of more nature for today, for sustainable development. And thank you very much. We have a short break of 10 minutes with the round table and another communication. Thank you very much.
vous sers un verre d'eau aussi. Il faut, ok, parfait.
Alors, l'idée, c'est que les intervenants sont là, on est un peu en décalé, d'accord. Voilà, au fond, si ça vous va.
Oui.
Quand tu recommenceras, quand vous recommencerez, est-ce que tu pourras signaler que, pour rappel, là, on est filmé et on est en direct. Ce sera disponible en replay après, c'est en français, en anglais.
On le dira en conclusion, non?
Non, en fait, on filme le public quand il pose des questions. Voilà, c'est ça. Juste de pour les questions, si quelqu'un se pose, qu'on fasse un petit truc, juste les questions.
Ok.
Vous êtes Nathalie de Vitro, vous êtes Van Schwald, vous
Vous allez les présenter, hein, c'est ça?
Oui, vous allez les présenter?
Oui, on va pas.
Je vais faire je vais les présenter au fur et à mesure.
Oui, déjà, très bien. On va pas
Et est-ce que tu
camper,
vas présenter
non, on va la présenter par contre. Et on va faire
Ah, vous n'avez pas mis? Ah, tout va bien. On est bien occupé.
Les cités-jardins du bassin minier.
D'accord. Donc celle du Nord.
Du Nord. Celles qui sont inscrites à l'UNESCO.
Oui. Il n'y a pas d'Ourge.
Si, il y a d'Ourge.
Je connais bien parce que c'est Walter qui a fait Jean Walter. C'est un architecte qui a travaillé dans les usines Michelin avec
Jean-Walter de Montbéliard qui a fait une toute première cité-jardin.
Oui.
Je crois qu'on est à quelques mois près de différence entre les deux.
Voilà.
C'est 1908 de mémoire.
Oui, c'est ça, il a fait en 1906-7 à Belfort.
Il y a plus de fois. On va reprendre.
Et nous, c'est pas Jean-Walter, c'est Ernest de Lille. C'était les deux.
Mais c'est intéressant. Parce que nous, on n'est pas c'était pas patronal, coopérative.
Là, il y a un mouvement là, donc donc dans une minute. Je vous présente.
Comme vous voulez, je peux me présenter.
D'accord, très bien. Je dis juste alors qu'on va démarrer la table de verre. Oui. Très bien. On va démarrer donc la table ronde de cette matinée.
We're going to start this panel discussion. It was going to be run by Anne-Catherine Ledeuf. Hi everyone, I'm Catherine Ledeuf. I direct Valorization, which is the Association of HLM organizations in the Greater Paris area. And we are new members in the cités-jardins community. I'm very happy to run this table ronde, first of all because we are new and happy, because I find that the topic this morning is so interesting, and because I think that many members, and we share a lot with the funding organizations in the Greater Paris area, and I think this sheds a lot of light, and we've had some good feedback on the capacity to be very active in the part of the inhabitants of city gardens, both in social life, in shared living, and having to do with heritage. So we're going to be handing over to inhabitants that are committed. They come from a great variety of areas. Those that are going to be expressing themselves are coming from the Paris area, from Draveil, from Brussels, Berlin, and the mining areas. And these territories have specific trajectories, very different trajectories. And there's another original aspect, is that they they have different uses, and they're professional experts. There's a designer, a historian, an archivist, and also a tourist guide, who are very interesting, and there's collective organizations as well, as partners in the neighborhood. So what we're going to do is try to understand, to see what are the involvement of these inhabitants, and how the governance works on a daily basis, and how this collective organization has lasted over time, and how these committed citizens can be very directly involved in deriving value from the architectural quality, but as well, and that's really another very strong involvement. And we're going to see how this direct mobilization of citizens is precious. And I think we've already had a lot of interesting testimony on the part of involved citizens via the evaluation in Saint-Brieuc. Serge Bonsky, I'm going to ask you. I think you're the typical profile. We talked about a passionate citizen and citizens and inhabitants that have adopted the Travail city garden. And there are a lot of new work going on in this particular city garden in Travail in the Paris area. So we'd like to know a little bit more about what's specific about the Paris Jardin, because you say it's one of the most involved one in the Paris area, due to partly for its local governance, which, if I've understood, since its origin, it's still a very strong identity even today. So what I suggest is that first of all, you tell us in what the city garden is a purist city garden initially, and what in today this originality is continuing. In the reality, and what is the role to help this identity last over time with a specific governance? First of all, I don't know if I'm speaking loud enough. Not really, sir. I'd like to thank the organizers to make it possible to come back after a visit in Suresnes, after a very positive visit, and I'd like to present the first city garden in France. Now, this is in a domain of 140 hectares, a kilometer from Paris, and this is a historical site because it used to belong to the nobles, and then it became handed over to workers. So the owners initially were Parisians that lived in the working in the 19th, the 20th districts, people that are modest, not necessarily working class, but employees, office or average. So they contributed to the cités-jardins. There were 20% of workers and artisans, and most were cooperants, such as Gabriel Pernel, who created the sheet. You're going to see this, we're going to hand it around, who worked for a carpet manufacturer and who worked in this way. So there are also shareholders. There are people that bought shares to build a house in Paris Jardin so as to be able to participate in managing this city garden and its maintenance. Now, the idea was to find, over 20 kilometers from Paris, a very healthy place close to Paris where you could cure tuberculosis. That was an important thing at the time. And between the Seine and the Forêt de Senart, the forest. And Epernay showed really what people wanted: a modern city garden where owners would be owners of small economical and for workers that were cheaper than in other lots in Sainte-Geneviève and that were designed by an architect whose name was Jean Voltaire, who was well known for what he did in the Peugeot area, in Mr. Peugeot's house as well. And he was also well known to do the Daviel city in Paris. So this architect took care of social housing, and he also produced the initial plan for Paris Jardin. In other words, 1911, 2 years after the Paris Jardin was created. Now this is where he saw how the 10 kilometers of road and paths located where the 322 houses were to be built, and all of the homes in Paris Jardin were controlled by an architect. Out of those 322, all had an architect's blueprint. And this was really, the purpose was to respect the history of the area that they bought from a big landowner who didn't want for workers to occupy this land. So that's the history. And it's true that in 1911, when the workers came to Paris Jardin, they sang the national hymn, which showed already their ideal as cooperants. And Voltaire designed the whole complex, and he also provided a particular type of management of the city garden. And the management was, they would have a general assembly, and all future owners of a house had one vote. And there was a committee whose purpose of urban experts or urban planners who had to respect the initial rules specific to this city garden. And that's what's unusual about this. The idea was never do speculation, never have intermediaries. There cannot be any profit when you're reselling a home. It's sold to the cooperative when you want to sell, and it's a participative democracy, one vote per person per housing unit. And the idea is that the part that is a shared portion, 17 hectares, in with ponds and so forth, and the 26 hectares were for the 322 individual homes with gardens between 500 square meters and 1,500 square meters. So, and that's the way it was. Now the difference, and I'll just conclude with this because I'm trying to keep it short. We are not a garden city. We consider that the pioneers that visited this in 2012, we don't have an infrastructure, as is the case in city gardens. We don't have a school, we don't have any businesses, we don't have and we don't want to do any politics or any religion in the city garden. And these are the ideals that will be gradually, starting in 1925, will be fought over and defended rapidly. This model, based on the different experience, it was the most purest of so the cooperative system is still going on. I'd like to insist a bit more on the duties and responsibilities and rights, because it's important to take the measure of this, and if they're purists, and what was the place in governance and what are the responsibilities in governance? Well, when somebody comes into the system in Paris Jardin, right now there are 12 new acquisitions every year. They have to respect, normally, the bylaws, the rights and opportunities at Paris Jardin. They have to respect the architectural standards, not modify neither the facade, and you have to respect as well the plantations. So you cannot cut down these remarkable trees, and they also have to accept the cooperative rules, and they have to attend the General Assembly, otherwise they get a fine. And if they're penalized, there can be recourse in front of the organizations that govern the city, whether it be the municipality of Draveil or the architect that handles the architect de Vence or the board of directors, as to see if the rules having to do with the urban development are being respected. One final point about this first sequence, because you were saying earlier that in the initial model there was an objective of non-profit making. So that's quite something that's quite different, and this is not neutral. It bothers me to talk about it. I'm very proud about the initial ideals, but there have been modifications in 1925, and realists who were directed by the chair, Asman, who was the friend of Henry Sellier. and they won, basically. Starting in 1925, it was possible to resell your home with making a profit. It was no longer any question of equipping the city with electricity and gas and so forth, and to go through the usual private service providers. And there was a major change, such that today, unfortunately perhaps, the houses are sold at very high prices to private individuals. And we've been accused sometimes of having sold out, and which I reject, obviously, but it's subject to discussion. I'm not judging you, sir. Natalie, perhaps your name is Nathalie de Vergifos. You live in a city garden, and you also have a cooperative system that is very well anchored, which has been lost in history. What you wanted to do was not so much to preserve that, but to recreate it. First of all, based on small local actions that gradually would make it possible to move along in a collective way. So could you tell us about that story and tell us a bit more about the way it is today? Sure. Basically, I lived in the Floréal cités-jardins that was presented yesterday morning. And at the basis of it all, it was above all individuals that needed housing, and they got mobilized to create two cooperatives. One was a typography, and the other were employees of the Caisse d'Épargne, and these were civil servants. So they worked to set up everything they could. In just a few years, several hundred houses were built, and two schools were created as well. And so there were people going to be chipping in to succeed in the project. So everything that was done initially was due to only the inhabitants. They are the ones that planned on parties or celebrations, and they also did the work to avoid the cooperative having to commit to huge expenses. So there's really a mobilization because they were co-owners of the whole thing. And that's fundamental, actually. The choice that was made was because we considered that if you're just a tenant, it doesn't, encourage you to get invested, but to be an owner might lead to the whole problem of speculation. So the cooperative system was seen as taking the best of both worlds, both an anti-speculation mechanism, but as well a real investment on the personal side, on everyone's part. So as time went by, the administrative context changed. The cooperative society lost a great part of their freedom of action, as it were, and the cooperative spirit had a tendency to gradually diminish because the city increasingly encroached and got closer to the cités-jardins, to the city garden. And so in La Floréal, we got mobilized to getting closer to ownership of property, and we extended our actions to deriving value from the matrimony, and we wanted to create bonding. For us, heritage in the neighborhood we're lucky enough to live in was in fact a factor of social cohesion in and of itself, which was stimulated by the attachment we have and also by the configuration of this area, which makes it possible to meet people in very different spaces. There's a room, and there are various isolated areas, which also requires a very strong involvement on the part of the founders of this new collective organization, because you said there was also a social trajectory which is of significant proportions. Maybe it was different from what was said just now. But this is perhaps not obvious. You had to navigate with inhabitants that were quite attached to this, and others for whom living in this is not the issue. For the people for whom the important thing was to have housing. Could you talk to us about this? Indeed, there was a change of sociological order. In Floréal, the older people would, it was not a family, it was a family village where we handed down one of the houses in this park from generation to generation. And so the attachment was in and of itself. Now, initially, the cités-jardins were not social housing, they were cheap housing. And you had to have some savings to be able to buy shares in this cooperative, which was not possible for workers who were pretty low on the salary scale. And so now there was an assimilation. Very simply, the cités-jardins were social housing. We've lost the sound. So this is a significant change that occurred. And in the past, living in the cités-jardins was a choice, a deliberate choice. But now, indeed, at least for one part, it's still a choice, but for others, it's just luck. They wound up enrolling on the list of, the waiting list, and they actually, and a housing unit freed up, and they were able to acquire it. But they might have wound up on the other side of Brussels in a different type of housing. And so what seemed to be obvious in the past is no longer the case, but you shouldn't have a vision of cleavage. I think that where there might be a cleavage would be with respect to this lifestyle. And it's interesting to see that what's being done these days echoes the comments 100 years ago. But there was no asphalt before. There was no. There was some precarious conditions, and it was kind of far away from their family and their references. And now we observe in the new arrivals, there aren't many businesses because with the new arrivals come from the city center. So there is a density in terms of services, and where they're more in the city center than in the city garden. And they have family bonds as well with the township that they left. So one can draw a parallel, an analogy between what was said 100 years ago and what's being said now. Amongst the new arrivals, there are people who, on the contrary, say this is great to be able to offer our children to grow up in such an environment, which is qualitatively totally different. In the city garden, it's 7 kilometers from the square, the main square in Brussels. It's very close. And in addition to that, there are people that have nostalgia for all of the ease at which they could live, in the city center and have community contact as well. Thank you. Rémi Gaudris, you are also an inhabitant in the cités-jardins, in a former mining city, I believe. And you work for a funding company who's taken over the old mining communities. So you're kind of working on the opposite. You're working vertically. As a fact of housing workers, and what you're going to be able to describe perhaps in your approach is to seize upon this rehabilitation and renovation project in the mining areas to have a more collective approach to participate in citizens' life in the city gardens, but also in developing the quality and the heritage. Perhaps you could tell us your story. Certainly. This is the biggest social housing, 65,000 housing units, 64,000. It was 95% of housing are semi-individual housing with gardens. So the number one city garden in France, that was built in France by Bruno Adouge. The architect was in Great Britain, in fact, and when he came back, he went further. He recruited the secretary of the association in France to help him design the city so as to apply the city garden rules, really seeking to have the best possible skilled people to help him have the best possible city garden possible. And what's unusual is that our heritage is changing of paradigms, depending on the inhabitants. Before, it was mainly miners or their wives. And so this particular population got older, and now it's replaced by people who are seeking social housing. Now, what's wonderful is that we can see the change in population and the life habits with gardens that are mainly becoming lawns, very clearly, with a few trampolines. And it's a wonderful patchwork, actually, a form of old with new. And one of my neighbors has a wonderful lawn, and the neighbor next door has chickens, and the one next door is in competition. I'm trying to do a vegetable garden. So there's multiple uses which are beautiful side by side in the same, lot, even if some usages are just incidental. And we have a tendency to slip from the cités-jardins to an association type organization with some people are raising pigeons. And this has become quite, so basically this is going sometimes beyond the city, and the inhabitants, the current inhabitants or former inhabitants sometimes wind up grouping together in associations. But we do have a concern about social bonding between the newer inhabitants with the older inhabitants and new arrivals. So we're trying to set up restructuring organizations. The one a few years ago, we tried to do this. We called it a new city, and tried to renew all of the city. We tried to densify it a bit. There were some constructions in the gardens to add certain things, but collaboratively. And we involved inhabitants in the process right from the beginning by asking them what they would like. And the first step was not to ask them, what do you want to do together, but what points bother you about the way it is personally. So we first tried to find out what the pain points were in respect to the individual tenants, because if we have a problem, for example, there was some problem had a problem with certain construction materials out of wood that were no longer in good condition. And you could see all of the pitfalls and all the difficulties, so that we could have this discussion once and solve it for everybody for whom it was a problem. And this worked really well. For example, Reaper Cafe and the daycare centers were decided on, and that's worked very well indeed. Others were a bit more, difficult. For example, loaning lawnmowers or whatever. Sure, I can loan my lawnmower, but not to anybody. And third, we had projects which didn't work at all, that didn't take. For example, one simple thing was laundry, a shared laundry. No, I want my own machine. I don't want other people to use my laundry, my washing machine. I like my own, this is my thing, and it's my environment. So to see, it was an interesting way to see what we can do together and what we need to do alone, and to see what points we could share on and where other areas where there were difficulties. The other thing we tried to do is to see if we could make transgenerational efforts. For example, the oldest inhabitants were proposing in the association framework to younger members to do some maintenance work, to repaint certain things and the fences or whatever and to keep the garden. In exchange, the young people could finance their driving license, and this made it possible to generate bonding within the city between the younger and older populations. And the third point we set up for a renovation project in the city, a massive renovation project that's ongoing even now, as well as the RBM renewal. Is a thermal renewal of 120 housing units. What's unusual here is that in some city gardens, Erwani, we set up which made it possible for inhabitants of the city to find a job in renovation work, to come and work in renovating their own city And so that made it possible for people who had difficulties getting back into employment to actually set foot back in the world of employment, and to in reinsertion by remaining right within the place they live in the framework of the projects. So all of these projects are taking place in a specific area. These are former mining communities. Could you tell us what this involvement has entailed? What has it been? What did it make possible or not? In terms of the actual history and the heritage, both architectural and social. Where do we stand today in this overall process, and what do you know about it? And in the new generation.
Ces projets, donc,
These projects as of today are ongoing. Renovation is not finished yet. On the other side, that allows us to have a test and propose other elements. So we don't have enough distance to know how much we can do as total. So we need some more time to be able to see what's going to be the next steps. We need to exchange more. I would say, Natalie, on all these questions of appropriation of the inhabitants of the garden cities, can you explain in a more concrete way how you have associated these inhabitants? You are a guide, you're a specialist on nature, and you have two specialities, and you accompany your neighbors or visitors. So how do you appropriate yourself to this valorization of this heritage, of the recognition, of the awareness of the advantages? And what you do towards the outside world, because there's a channels opening or not opening the city to people coming from outside. How do you organize them? And what happens? Because actually it's living space. To the last point, it's a subject of discussion, because some people are proud that people come and visit the heritage where they're living, and others they prefer not too many visitors. So they hesitate. So how do these visits take place, and what are we having as a storytelling about the inhabitants? So when I started doing and organizing these visits 5 years ago, I spoke with inhabitants, and they told me, oh, we learned so many things since we were kids. We knew the immaterial history, and the material history was present to us by the elderly, and we are proud. So together to give more value to this heritage was an advantage for allowing have more exchange than just being neighbors. So there was a participation and a complicity, and since April 2022, we have the owner of 80% of the lodging. We have a room available on weekends, and thanks to subsidies that we got from Brussels, we could open our offices. It's not official, but we call it a visitor centers, if I can call it that way, to welcome the visitors coming that would like to discover the garden cities and the inhabitants. So this was an opportunity for us to show that this heritage is alive, it's evolving, and we would like to recognize its value. And throughout the visits, we would like to talk about the urbanism, the history, and so on, but as well to talk about the challenges of today, and talk about the questions. How can we inspire with our garden cities the future? So this visitor centers is managed 100% by inhabitants. They're all volunteers on Sunday basis, and there are 52 volunteers that we meet every weekend to welcome visitors and organize guided visits. We also have a whole organization to recognize some inhabitants. So we have postcards that are pictures made by the inhabitants. It's not external photographers. it's native pictures that are sold as postcards. So we create a kit of a walk of the garden city so that people can see the pictures, and we do share with the cooperative association the talents. We don't invite external artists to make an exposition here, but we want to show the talents of our city, who is painting, who makes ceramics, who likes gardening, and so on. It's another way of proposing, discovering our garden city. And we had the heritage visits as well. I was in charge, and we have another guide as well. She would make visits of nature, not only for the landscape, not only for history, but what can you find today from nature in our city garden. That's very nice that you include a contemporary story and allow us a reconciliation of the different ways to appropriate yourself, your space. Yes, we can say it's the factor of the link. We are talking about an idea that we do live in a place that has a specific value, and we would like to know how far this place could be a factor of social cohesion. And it was very interesting, as you have said, on this professional aspect. So our hope is to be able to construct a project, even if it's in a very beginning phase based on volunteers, but how can we be a place for social cohesion, but as well for professional insertion, because 30% of the people don't have an employment. So there's a great challenge for the society, and we do have this heritage that is recognized by the place that it occupies in Belgium. And the question is, how can we have a professional insertion? And we are colleagues, and we're not only neighbors. So, Serge, if we can talk about the cooperative, what does it change and what does it allow us as a collective to do as heritage, as architecture, history, and common history? We're 825 inhabitants, and of course there are some new arrivals, some departures, and we are aware that we have very specific heritage. We have a castle that was built 1840, and it's still our common house. So we have our General Assembly over there, and we have also a Latin that from 1720 that has been restored many times. We don't know what the destination was, but it was illumination of the new year. It has been destroyed, and you can see the Latin here. And the other elements is that every house have to keep the characteristics of who does propose a domain of every owner that had tried to preserve and keep. So we have little lakes, keep the wooden areas, who keep these water areas and vegetation. And many people also mentioned that every historic tree has its value, it has not to be cut, and so on. We walk about vegetation, and we have as well the possibility to have a drink, and we can talk about goats or trees or maple trees or whatever. We have the helps of history, and there were two books 1984 and 2011 for the 100 years of Paris-Jardins. So we used the archives that we had available. We are owners of these archives, and we tried to keep the link with all the owners that were there, even if they were British and they lived in the castle in 1820, people that were investors from America in 1800. We have contacts still with the pioneers that came, like Walter or Naguère or others. So we try to keep this memory of the city of Paris-Jardins, and we are there hoping we can communicate with the outside world and having a number of manifestations for the external world so that we can communicate. Knowing that cohesion is an important word politically speaking right now, but we have the summer festival that we're going to celebrate tomorrow. We will have a big tent. We will invite visitors from other city gardens, and this memory walk is important, and we will soon restore the orangerie, which is one of the important buildings, and next year we will restore the cinema, and we have our own four walls, but we have also common life. And finally, we want to say that this memory is something we want to integrate in the Association of City Gardens, that we are members since 2 years, and it's a pleasure for us to share our history and the history of other garden cities. You have all these steps that have been presented. And it's nice to have all these changes with the other people in city gardens. We cannot say all the details of the work that you're doing, but I do see that you have your experience, you have your life, and an approach that I see is an added value. You are open to other organizations, and you ask yourself how much are you going to communicate with your neighbors, and how do I negotiate with the city hall. You mentioned projects like restructuring garden and the city garden area, which play a role of your green space, and you need the support of the municipality and department. So I think we should go to the next subject. Van Bushveld, I hope I'm spelling correctly your name, and you have an approach with two original approaches. First of all, you are part of a collective that did not exist before you went there, and there's an evolution where you have a social lessor that sold it to a private company, and in France it was something that we estimated being very worrying, but there's no collective, and you have done very radical approaches that you mentioned in your article. The goal is there's inefficiency of authorities and nothing has been done for restoration. And the other thing is that your approach is very great in the Todd zone in Berlin, in Germany. You want to do things in Germany. Can you tell us a few more things about the originality of all the things that you have heard so far?
Sorry, I have to speak in English because my French is so bad you wouldn't like it really. As introduced, we had problems with authorities who couldn't cope with all the tasks, but they were not completely inefficient. I wouldn't say it, put it like this. But basically, I would like to present a few projects that we did, and they were all conceived in order to get preservation and communication issues about the 6 World Heritage Estates in Berlin online or to a broader public. we heard about these 6 heritage estates yesterday. You see them now on the beamer in chronological order. They have been planned and erected in between 1913 and 1934, facing a big shortage of housing. The first 4 of them have largely been conceived and designed by the architect Bruno Taut. There were 11 other architects involved, especially in the last 2 ones. And what is important, 2 landscape architects, Lieberecht Migge and Ludwig Lesser, who is the great-grandfather of my wife, who's also acting in the family tradition as a landscape architect. And 2 of these, the first 2 that you see, are owned by cooperatives. All the other 4 are privatized. They used to be city-owned until 1998. Then the city of Berlin sold the big housing company, and this whole portfolio changed 4 times over the stock market. I personally live in the upper right corner in the Fer de Cheval, Hufeisensiedlung, which is the biggest one, the most famous one, and probably also the most complicated one to preserve, because we are the only one where almost 700 row houses with gardens were entirely privatized, means were sold to individual owners. So we have like more than 650 individual owners who are supposed to take care of a world heritage. This is a difficult situation, and this was the starting point for all the projects that we conceived. Here you see the area, which is like 28 acres and contains 2,000 dwellings. Here you see the 6 building sections. What is special is that building section 1 and 2 are actually following the paradigm of garden city movement, whereas building sections 6 especially draws the line to the second big paradigm of urban town planning, the arrangement in rows. The architect Bruno Taut is very famous for his variety and individualization. You see how he combined serial building prototypes in order to build cheap with individual patterns and color systems. Although it's a listed monument since '86, not all the things went well. This is a photo from 2003, as you see, and you see that the garden maintenance was very poor. This was one thing why we struggled to get it listed as a garden monument, thing that we have in Germany that you don't have in France, as I know. But this is helping because it shifted the responsibilities and also the awareness. This is what was happening starting from 2000, that the row houses went for sale to individual owners. And these are a few things that resulted: parking lots in the front gardens, wrong fences and stuff like that. Not really surprising. 2007, we founded a local association in order to get some official representation and in order to apply for public funding for the next project. No, sorry. Of course, when the row houses went for sale, this also meant that we have a process of gentrification. The incoming people were much better well off, much better educated, and so on and so forth. So the local association started the tradition of having street celebrations every once in a year to get old and new neighbors involved together. And we also have a lottery, and the main prize of the lottery is always to win 20 fruit trees, which is a design feature that has been gone through over the decades. Actually, the association was founded to get public funding for this project, which is a huge database. It's a website that contains 2,000 micro-sites for all the individual apartments and houses. So you enter your street name, your address, and then you're coming to an individual microsite for Pasta Behrensstraße, for instance, with all the details. All the details means that we have 150 detail plans per unit, and they all can be put down as or generated as dynamically generated PDF files, which you can use to apply for for any kind of work that has to be done. This was a really huge project, which we finished in 2011, and then we started to do a lot of lectures, guided tours, and things like that. And my main profession is a graphic designer, so I developed an exhibition which is now shown in a mixture between a neighborhood cafe and an exhibition space, where we have the history of the Hufeisensiedlung explained and also of the other 5 housing estates. Later on, I put up a small architectural guide made from the exposition. And this is my favorite project. This is a project that my wife and I did on our private behalves. There was a house for sale, a small house, but it has lots of original substance. So we had a hard time figuring it out, but then we bought the house and started renovating it due to the historic originals, which means that we are also into the color restoration, which you see here. And this is the floor layout in a colored way. And this is the house with a also restored garden and the typical fruit trees, which contains some kind of possibility for self-accommodation. I have to say we didn't get public funding for that project, but we renting the house. It's a mixture between a holiday house and a museum, and it provides space for 2 to 4 overnight guests. And it's the only place within the 6 World Heritage Estates where you get really authentic interior design and coloring. We are very lucky that we received the European Union Prize for Cultural Heritage, which is quite rarely granted, and a few other awards, and we also get great press and media coverage. And to spread the idea of modernism and architecture even further, the city of Berlin joined forces with the cities of Dessau and Weimar, which has the Bauhaus heritage, and we sat together and discussed how to get this message, the value of modernism, even broader, and we've conceptualized a triangle of modernism, linking up the 3 cities. Every 3 years we have a quite huge program. In Berlin we have like 150 single events from 25 partners, all or mostly civil partners. And the next event will take place in October this year. And since 2019, I'm acting as the curator and also as the designer from the start. So if you're interested, we would be pleased to have you here. There are a few social media channels. And the most recent, or the second recent project was this one. This is a website that runs smoothly on smartphones and on desktop applications about all the 6 World Heritage Estates, which includes a mighty glossary and a few other things like biographies. And so this can be triggered by QR codes that are attached to local buildings. So this is an opportunity how to get the digital media smoothly into the neighborhoods. And, well, it's also a quite mighty project with interactive tours through all 6 estates. Not really related to garden cities is the last project I would like to present, which is a network, a meta-network of civil organizations who are all in the preservation business of Berlin. And we are currently planning to publish a red list of endangered buildings, also on a website and a map interface, in order to create more awareness about these issues. So these were the projects I would like to present. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Je crois que tout le monde dans la salle a bien noté votre invitation à venir visiter cette cité plus que remarquable de Bruno.
It's great to know of this magnificent work that has been done for the World Heritage of the UNESCO. Maybe there's some people in the room that would like to take the floor, make comments or ask questions. We have to stop in 10 minutes because there is a lunch break. And we have 10 minutes to speak with the floor. We lost the picture. Good morning. I live in a cooperative of 1,400 lodgings, and I like that I pay for maintenance, and as soon as I have a problem of water closet, there's a team that's part of the cooperative, and they do the works that I need. It's cheaper and it's less complicated. Does anybody of you have any experience of lessors or other associations or cooperatives if you have a common team of workers that do the works and the maintenance? If you have a problem in your bathroom or anywhere else? I think it's a question for Serge. If you ask me, I will answer. We are members and we pay every year an amount of money for the maintenance of the streets, of lights, of the chateau and other infrastructure. But for problems that a participant could have, we have only one gardener at full time, and he is doing hours and hours of maintenance of garden, and we are obliged either ourselves to be your own plumber or whatever you have to do if you are able for repairs. So 90% of the lodging are private. And the relationship is like if you have a lessor, and when there's a problem, you get in contact with the cooperative, and either they do the repairs that are part of your contract, and in the technical team, they have a very big technical team, and they can do the repairs directly by Logis Floreal workers, or they will need an external expert, and they will be contacted. Anybody else wants to give an element of response? A question for our German colleague. 3 short questions, actually. First of all, what is the status of the owning company of this heritage that we have seen? Are they gemeinnützige GmbH or something else? Or is a mixed economy? Gemischte Gesellschaft? What is the legal frame and definition of your companies that own it? What are the public or para-public companies or private companies? What are the requirements? Are they different according to the legal frame if the lessor manages in a different way, or does usually private lessors don't care of anything else and just want to get money for their shareholders? And third question is European Federation for Living. Do you know this network? Dvorak is a company that does a lot of administration of goods. These are my three questions. Thank you very much.
Okay. Basically, as mentioned, 2 of the housing estates are owned by cooperatives ever since the 1910s and 20s. And all the others are owned by Deutsche Wohnen, Vonovia Group. These are the 2 biggest real estate companies in Germany who have joined forces. The company that acquired the housing association GEHAC, which was erecting most of the estates, was actually a small company, but then it would be taken over on the stock market. That means all the last 4 owners were listed stock market companies. But to be fair, one might add that Deutsche Wohnen really takes good care about preservation issues. They have not a good name in social issues, but this takes no wonder. I think the actual crime was that the city of Berlin, they were short of money, but that they sold the top-level housing company of the 1920s with a huge portfolio of 12,000 buildings designed by an architect like Bruno Taut. So this shouldn't have happened, but at least, well, they are taking good care, of course, looking after their stock owners, but this is, I think, okay. And we have a quite good system of authorities and preservation, but it's also a bit complicated because sometimes are the district's authorities responsible, sometimes it's the city of this authority that is responsible. And this is, for instance, why we struggled, or my wife struggled very hard to get it listed as a garden monument, because this shifted the responsibilities from the district level to the city level, which is much better. I hope I answered your questions.
Merci. Alors, il y a une dernière question à ma droite.
There's one last question on my right. I think that one of the common features of the various operations we've just spoken about is that they've all had a change in their status, and I think that's one of the points that poses problems for everyone in different ways. I had a more precise question about Florial. I don't really understand how the cooperative status is distinguished from what would be a public office for, for social housing, that people could submit their applications and then wind up there to require housing. So what's the cooperative status anyway? How does that work? You are pointing out the current difficulty. Initially, there were 2 cooperative organizations that were separate with their own status and their own bylaws and their own way of working. And they benefited from public funding and criteria for accessibility, which were quite broad factors. Now, with the creation of Brussels Capital and the regionalization was federal and in terms of housing. So the Brussels Capital and the means of working were different, and the people, when they were seeking housing, had the logic that the children were a priority, and you needed to want to live in the cités-jardins specifically and to be enrolled in that. Relatively recently, there was a system of assignment based on a single a list. If you were looking for housing that was accessible, you enrolled on a single list, and you checked off the number of townships you wanted. You're in a situation you needed a roof over your head, you were going to check off all of the companies that exist, whereas previously you had to do individual actions. So the cooperator status still exists, but the actual control in terms of management goes beyond the board. So the cooperatives are still administrators of the cooperative. So formally, I would say there's no change. But in the actual practice, however, it has become much more linked to, social housing, public social housing, and respecting public rules. I don't know if I've answered your question. On my side, for Paris Jardin, the status is the statutes are practically the same. The bylaws are almost the same. They changed in 1925 when there was a problem, of change in regime. So currently, members, agree to respect the initial conditions, and we're still a cooperative society. We voted a few years ago the fact that our status as a cooperative was prolonged by 100 years. So those who are in this cooperative commit to respecting the rules and uses of the statuses and the distribution of the city as a collective space and as belonging to a single owner. So the status, this is distributed to each change in owners, and we attach a great deal of importance that this be respected as a whole, but they're not totally respected. We've reached the end of this sequence. I think that we can thank our participants. And thank you for moderating. We're going to be welcoming the last part of the morning's proceedings with a bit of an inversion. We are going to be, for a question of timing, and a practical issue, I'd like to invite Antonio Blanco Pastor from the Manchester School of Architecture to join us. I'm going to hand over to you. First of all, we're going to hear from Antonio Blanco Pastor, and you can ask him questions if you like. And then we're going to be hearing Viva de Fekane and Stepanas. Can you join, if you'd like to sit on the side so that we can see the slides, see Mr. Pastor's slides, that would be great if you could do that. The floor is yours. Hi, everyone.
As you know. So, well, my name is Antonio Blanco Pastor, and okay, no problem. I'm Spanish, so it will be easy. So, my name is Antonio Blanco Pastor, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Malaga in Spain. And the title of my presentation is Rewriting the Fate of the Empty Spain, which is a serious problem. My presentation, in general words, is about ruralism, which is about rural development, and it's also about the main issues that more and more rural areas are facing now in the Spanish territory and also in the whole world. To be more specific, I will explain the impact of this phenomenon, which is the phenomenon of rural depopulation in the Spanish territory. And I will outline some principles taken from the Garden City model in order to outline something like some initiatives and a framework to overcome this situation, well, to try to overcome this situation in the future as a proposal, which is part of the doctoral thesis that I'm currently doing. So, if you see the Spanish map, in 1900, most spaces within Spain didn't exceed 20 inhabitants per square kilometer, and there were no significant urban centers, but rather the Spanish territory was mainly composed of communities that maintained a social and demographic balance throughout the whole country. In contrast, a century later and even now, large part of the Spanish territory is scarcely populated, with municipal densities well below those considered critical, such as 5 inhabitants per square kilometer and 10 inhabitants per square kilometer. If you see the European map, the population distribution of Spain is facing one of the most dramatic situations, only comparable with the situation of Norway, for example, despite having better climate conditions than in Northern Europe. At the local level, we can find plenty of examples of declined rural communities in the Spanish territory, such as these small villages located in the provinces of Huesca, Teruel, and Segovia, which share quite similar issues, like population shrinkage, lack of production, shortage of amenities, bad infrastructure, no internet access, and aging population. However, these kind of communities have been implementing over time a series of initiatives to overcome these issues, like, for example, the influence of social media to attract people from the cities to live in the countryside, or, for example, some initiatives aimed at attracting South American immigrants to live in these villages, other initiatives about tourist development, and others about offering free housing for any young couple wanting to move to these villages. But so far, these kind of initiatives have not been successful enough to attract a large number of people to live in the countryside. So the question is, how could we do it? Well, this question raises a series of questions, such as how could we overcome this situation without any public funding? How could we foster the resilience of rural settlements to cope with their isolation from the globalized world? How could we conserve, transform, and update existing rural areas in fulfilling the needs of likely future rural communities? And finally, which is, in my view, the most important question to be answered, how could we encourage the decentralization of people and means of production into rural areas? Well, in response to these questions, and mainly in response to the last question, the town-country model, also known as the garden city model, which was devised, as you already know, Ebenezer Howard in 1898, represented a feasible alternative at that time to build new rural communities from scratch in the countryside. To describe the advantages of the town-country model, Howard proposed a new magnet, which is the magnet at the bottom of the picture, with the best features of town and country, such as beauty of nature, low rates, low rents, low prices, and so on, in order to attract people from urban areas to live in the countryside. According to Howard's definition of the garden city model as a unique combination of proposals, this model was the result of overlapping a series of strategies in different dimensions aimed at building model communities, living and working in ideal commonwealths, and through a cooperative economic system. Well, thanks to the combination of all these principles, it was possible the building of the two first garden cities in the UK, Letchworth Garden City and Welling Garden City. And their achievement in terms of inner colonization can be summarized, in my view, by three main aspects. their strategies to encourage the decentralization of population and industry, their financial and land tenure system, and their urban design principles. Well, to encourage the decentralization of population and means of production, Howard proposed the creation of a territorial scheme composed of garden cities, small settlements, and big cities in the form of the social city of Howard. And indeed, this scheme was somehow implemented for the building of the two first garden cities, Letchworth and Welling, by building these new garden cities along a pre-existing railway track from London. A century later, this kind of scheme, territorial scheme, has been taken up by the Association Connected Cities in 2016 to redevelop existing rural settlements as a modern version of the Howardian social city, but with a few modifications, because instead of building model communities or new rural communities from scratch, this model is about redeveloping existing rural settlements. Within this context, in my view, this system, for example, about railway connections, the large part of the Spanish territory has a big problem of abandoned railway tracks and others about to close. And for example, like these abandoned railway routes between Valladolid and Ariza, which in my view has a great potential to be reopened for this purpose regarding the previously mentioned scenario. And to do this, the main thing is to identify in the territory some rural settlements, like for example Aranda de Duero, in between these along this railway track, which has different rural settlements within 15 minutes journey by train on both sides. And through this system, Aranda de Duero could become a large hub town and could create a new sub-regional group of villages, towns, and together with opportunity areas in between for production purposes, in order to become a modern version of the Howardian social city in the form of linear shires. Well, in addition to this territorial scheme, which I propose for the Spanish territory, let's move on to explain the financial and land tenure system of the garden city. In the case of Letchworth, a joint stock company was founded to develop the settlement, and their net profits were, on the one hand, divisible by way of a dividend, which was 5% per year at that time, at the beginning of the garden city, and the surplus of the net profits were saved for public purposes, such as, for example, the construction of a railway station, public buildings, lighting, water supply, gardening, amusement, and even for the embellishment of the town. Regarding and this system was used for achieving a self-financing system without any kind of public expenditure on infrastructure. Sorry? Regarding the land tenure system, the company decided to establish a dual system where the land was held in trust by the company and the buildings were owned or rented by people in order to avoid land speculation and assure the affordability of houses. Thanks to the Letchworth experience, other economists like Dr. Sean Turnbull has heavily inspired by this precedent and developed the concept of cooperative land banks, which consist of according to Turnbull, a self-financing system upon a dual land tenure system. However, unlike the garden cities management structure, the shares of a cooperative land bank would be held by residents rather than by investors in order to comply with Howard's self-governance scheme. To do this, Turnbull proposes to distribute shares among the pioneer homeowners and the existing owners in proportion to the area occupied and time of permanence. And in addition to this, adult residents would have one vote each, so that the cooperative land bank could take the role of a community land trust. And I think that this economic dimension has a great potential to revitalize rural communities in Spain. Finally, to sum up the urban design principles of the garden city, the urbanist model was the result of a series of planning schemes and common areas scattered throughout the settlements through the layout of pathways, parks, squares, sport courts, tree-lined boulevards, and open areas in the form of green buffers, through the preservation of existing trees, the creation of accents in the building lines, and the implementation of the principle of closure to provide a picturesque townscape, and through the implementation of village greens, cul-de-sacs, and allotments to encourage the spirit of cooperation. To do this, or to explain how to do it, let me show you an academic project which was carried out by students at the Manchester School of Architecture as part of work that was supervised by me last year. And the location of the village was in the province of Malaga, on the south of Spain, and the name is Alfarnatejo. This village is located or is surrounded by different small villages and towns sharing the same problems of rural depopulation. And at the local level, this village is surrounded by farmland, woodland, pasture land, mountainous areas, and a small village with some problems of lack of amenities, bad infrastructure, and about 500 people living there. To improve this situation, the students draw a master plan and to implement the principles that I mentioned before, the students laid out green buffers in between the houses and the public buildings in the form of village greens, parks, and squares in order to enhance the daily walks of residents and also to bring nature in the core of the town. To provide a picturesque townscape, the students proposed the preservation of existing trees and riverfronts for the expansion of the village, in addition to the creation of new group of houses in this way, by simulating the kind of rural pattern that you can find within the village in order to provide a picturesque townscape. And finally, to encourage the spirit of cooperation, the students proposed the reusing and the reuse of empty plots in between houses for some common activities, for gathering, and also some new common gardens, like allotments, recreational grounds, and within and outside the future residential blocks. In short, the main aim of my thesis is to outline a framework with the capability to regenerate existing rural areas and through the adaptation of the garden city model for new rural realities. This way, through linear shires and opportunity areas in a territorial level, also through the implementation of cooperative land banks to achieve a self-financing system, and through the implementation of the garden cities urban form or urban principles, design principles, to regenerate existing rural settlements and also for their expansion. This way, small rural settlements with the problems that I mentioned before could be redesigned and expanded in order to become prosperous, sustainable, attractive, and self-reliant communities across the countryside. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup pour cette présentation.
Thank you for this presentation, which helps us get into this, the beginning of what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. Given the time factor, it's very tight. We're going to take one or two questions, if there are any, for Mr. Pastor. I think there are two here. I don't think we can take many more. Thank you for your presentation. The model that you were talking about with the problems of infrastructure between cities that are or towns that are very far apart. The first John Miller in the 20s gave up the model of Garden City and to do a linear city. Is this system, could that not be better adapted or adapted with the principles of city gardens? By switching to a linear, would this not be able to be adapted to be able to supply a solution that would make it possible to maintain the infrastructures that weren't working? Maybe we can take the questions and respond to them all in one go. Let's have the other questions.
We suggest, as the time is very short, that we take the three questions and you answer globally.
Okay, perfect.
Do you agree?
Quite much better. Okay.
Okay. Hi, Susan of Hertfordshire. Antonio, that was great, and I felt a sense of connection because I've done similar master planning-based design work myself in recent years. Howard, as you know, put food at the centre of his proposals, and as you said, it was the sort of string of pearls, as Sir Peter Hall said, along the railway line north of London, enabled by Metroland. And as you also pointed out, that master planning was articulated by Barry Parker and Raymond Unwin, and all those aspects that you showed, you know, very much their subtle work as master planners, and still, I think, are very robust. And I would say that in recent years in the United Kingdom, in the discussion of a new round of garden cities, which we'll cover later this afternoon, the notion of garden villages along railway lines, reopening closed railway lines from the 1960s, has been a theme because it was thought politically it would help revitalise areas. That was good political news for the Conservative right, but also the scale would be more acceptable to local communities rather than bigger, more service-hungry towns. But I think it's important to remember there were not rural communities. These are rural-urban communities. And so I don't think Howard was looking at a revival of ruralism per se, but rather rural-urban. And my final point, sorry, it's a long point rather than a question. In my own work on making space for food in Hatfield, a new town, I did a series of urban design interventions from the peri-urban edge into the town centre, orchards, reviving mid-block allotments, reviving the town centre market, pottagers on the hamlets roundabout. So I think we share some territory and we should talk about this, but I agree with you, there is a huge possibility as part of our massive retrofitting activity that we need in our conurbations to think of using these garden city model sympathetic approaches, as has been done in Poundbury and in Newquay by the Duchy of Cornwall, that can help us to make these resilient nature-based solution approaches and to help with aspects of depopulation and population poorly configured. So just a comment really rather than a question.
Thank you for your presentation. And I think it's your presentation allowed us to understand that the original scope of Howard's model was to understand the garden city at the level of the comprehensive global planning of spatial national planning, or spatial planning, and then also it led the way to national planning. And if I can make a comparison with France, in France, in the post-war period, we have the geographer, which is Jean-François Gravier, who actually addressed the problem of rural depopulation with the idea that we have to decentralize housing, infrastructure, and also industries in small existing cities. Do you have in Spain, as we had in France with Jean-François Gravier, in academics, do you have geographers or economists or sociologists who try to address this problem of depopulation? And Jean-François Gravier is very, very well known in France because he wrote in 1947 Paris et le désert français, Paris and the French desert, with this idea that there is a very big city, which is Paris, and then a French desert and desertification. So do you have the same equivalent in Spain?
Thank you.
Regarding your last question about if in Spain we have some experts to improve the situation, there are some experts, but when I'm discussing with some of them, most of them regarding the problem of the rural depopulation in Spain, most of them think that there is no future for these communities because most of these communities have 50 people living there, or maybe 200 people. So they think it's a big problem because, as you saw on the map, mainly the mid part sorry, not the mid part, the mid north of the country is totally empty. So it's a huge problem. It's very difficult to address this situation just with one dimension. So there are some strategies which are proposed by political parties, for example, to reopen some abandoned railway routes, and some of them are now reopened, and they are experiencing some improvements in terms of mobility and commuting between the rural settlement and the big city, but not in terms of self-containment. There are no proposals regarding this question about how to redevelop and revitalize these rural communities in terms of self-containment, in terms of self-reliance. So that's a big problem. So sadly, we don't have expert people like your geographer. So in Spain, and regarding your comment, I totally agree with you that the future. Maybe the future, I don't know, but maybe the future of the garden city model is something like an evolution of this model for different branches, not just the suburban branch, which is quite familiar in different countries. For example, in my hometown in Malaga, we have a neighborhood which is called cités-jardins, which means garden city, but actually it's not a garden city. It's a suburban garden community, like, for example, in different, like, for example, sorry, I forgot the name. But I think that maybe, in my view, that's the way. And I totally agree with you that, for example, by redeveloping existing rural settlements, like, for example, the proposal of connected cities, is a good idea, despite not being a very good idea in terms of design, but at least in terms of ethos and social distribution. And regarding your question, sorry.
C'était à propos de la cité linéaire, du modèle de cité linéaire.
With respect to the
So the linear city, which is an idea that was coined and was devised by a Spanish, I don't know if you know that, Arturo Soria, at the end of the 19th century. This idea was a very good idea, for example, for the city of Madrid. And this system could to decentralize the kind of place of living and the place of production along a tramway, not in a railway track. But regarding your question that how the garden city at the beginning was in a different model than now, I think that in the Spanish territory it's possible, I think, to create new garden cities like the 20th century garden city. But in my view, the most important thing to address is not to build garden cities in the Spanish territory, is to take advantage of what is already there, which is this big problem of rural communities, and to try to improve this situation, but in a small scale, not by creating, as she said, new garden cities in the form of cities rather than rural communities or urban communities. So I think that that's more important in my view, but I don't know if I answered the question.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
Et je pense qu'on va vous libérer. Donc, merci beaucoup, Antonio Pastor.
Thank you, Antonio Pastan. We'll give the floor now. Stefan Devikis to talk about Lithuania and your intentions in Lithuania. We won't have much time. But we expect your presentation. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting us. We would like to present garden cities in Lithuania. In Lithuania, this arrives between the two wars. Since 2030, garden cities are there near Vilnius by Polish architects. Koda has, since the 20s, the urban plan made by Jokimas and Franzen in 1920 onwards. It's a development that these cities are not thought as independent cities. They are residential areas and areas with a green area that are clean and healthy. The project of project cities in Master Oget called in Hegelonov is here in an area of 535 hectares by Forgevich in the surrounding of Vilnius, next to the train station railways. This area was as a sanatorium for leisure time. During the war and the Soviet period, and they use a train station. The city of Kaunas has a green forest and a green hill. Since 1930, of the Lithuanians, this area is developed like the tradition of the garden cities. They have a municipality spirit till today, but the pressure of real estate is tough. One has to fight for social and architectural heritage. The development plan and the way people live in Lithuania is elaborated by Kazim Rasheshel in was a project planning done by 1974 for new villages that were the building of the settlement designed by the architect Stanislav Kalina. In creating the village, the farm manager, architects and other artists tried to meet the needs of the inhabitants seeking functionality, comfort and beauty in each new space. There was a university campus and agriculture saving. The campus is made by buildings and a street with a half circle. The architects like Antana Storia and Ermentina Susgalja looked and tried to create the plans as they were made for the initial plan, including the green areas. Since 1958, in this campus, numerous plantations were carried out with various parks that have been created, and arboretum and woodlands. The arboretum was designed by the head of the faculty of forestry, Nikolaos Lukinas, and lecturer Leonas Chibras. The needs of the academic complex have been continuously expanding. Different plantation and an arboretum have been added, as well as a system of streets have been developed in the future. Today's transformation, you will see, is still used and is ongoing evolution. Green areas are kept. Trees grow, but His Majesty the automobile car has taken more and more important surface. It becomes a problem of the campus. Guyonis is another village where you will have the center of forest and the College of Forest and Engineers. The city has around a huge green area that was created in the 60s. And that's where the architect Antanastauros lived with other specialists, forester and others. People living in this garden village are very happy living there. And they're happy because the exceptional site has an artificial lake which is just next to the campus. The modern city garden offers a quality of life in a natural environment, and people wish to go there, and the rates are very high for real estate. We have to underline that there are functions that are multiple for this city garden. There's a park that can be used for research for the agricultural department, and the needs of the village must be satisfied. That is in a constant development and has to stay a garden city. And the third function is to satisfy the needs of the city of Kaunas, like a park of free time and leisure. The village Yuknaitsi. The preparation of this village was made in 1974 by the Institute of the Agriculture Construction. It was made by two architects, and there is a big farm as well. with the director, Zygmunt Doctor, who had an axial program. It's not necessary to have a park next to the colony, but the colony itself will be inside the park. The architects that are well known, Francesco De Vitro and Urka Kishkin and others, have worked here a lot for a long period, since 1970 till 1991. As of today, the village and the life in this village is a bit complicated. In 2010, this was a part of the list of the urban heritage list of Lithuania, and at present the village is gradually losing its architectural unity as owners want to make changes to the facade of their houses and of the type of green fencing and so on, because of the different changes. They don't feel anymore subject to a building permit. And that is a consequence of the rules of Soviet public life. Owners must add or try to add parking lots and accept planification, but they do a lot of things by themselves. So today it's necessary to rethink both of the revitalization of the villages and the means of ensuring the comfort of the inhabitants to diversify the architecture while restoring the quality of the site. Traque is a big park in the village, and this big park, Traque was made by two French artists during the Soviet period. The transformation of Traque was a village developed during the Soviet period and now is a green lung for the specific research village. The site is still open to development and has a value as a natural and cultural heritage in the Vilnius suburbs. The state park was created using the river valley landscape and the scope of the majestic Voke River valley. And this allows us to keep the springs flow, which are natural, and you can use it as well for fishing, wooden slopes, and a unique landscape. This is incorporated in the city of Vilnius, and territory urban planning of houses include individual houses, and it's part of the vast park and alleys because of the ecological plan and the different activities in this the village Traku looking for renovations of the project so that life can continue and has to be rethinked. As of today, the park has been taken over by the Vilnius municipality since a few years. The owner now is the municipality. The old pass has been redesigned by the agency urban planning, and the urban planning designer has a comfortable structure. After having taken this renovation park project, there's a lot of future. So since we are at the end of our time, and the conclusion is too academic. We're going to make a few words summarizing what said the previous speaker as well, that what is the garden city as a method? It's something that you will find as a creation of small new towns beyond the urban boundaries. It's very useful for Lithuania. Many people mentioned that people like living in the suburban areas, having the neighborhood. We had the manoir in the park and development of the village, and these models need to be elaborated. But we also need, compared to other interesting interventions of this great event, in Lithuania, we must work again for our patrimony and heritage of city gardens in order to be able to continue in Vilnius and in other cities the research that is necessary. Maybe there's a need of studies about the public life and the role of government in order to be open to the future. And what concerns the Soviet Union heritage, we have to keep and understand the principal ideas of the garden cities and avoid destructive constructions. This would be my summary. Thank you very much. Thank you for this very clear presentation and that you respected our time schedule. Maybe we have some questions from the floor, I don't know. Any questions in the room? We've seen the importance of garden cities and what the link is with the railway system. So my question is, maybe we can ask ourselves, like in the round table, of the way how representatives from cooperatives could use their voice to exchange information with common transportation networks that allows to connect the city with downtown and avoid the pressure of cars, that cars get into the garden cities and occupy too much space. Maybe we'll get all the other questions together. What is the model of the garden city in Lithuania during the Soviet Union period? There were Polish architects as well that had ideas to adapt to the Soviet period. I would say it depends from both sides. Land was owned by different landlords, and in Poland we had a different approach. It was complicated when between the two wars this land belonged to Poland, but now it's Lithuania. In Vilnius we have Polish architects that were working, but on the same token the Lithuanians would follow the ideas of city gardens and ideas coming from France, because architects were trained between the two wars abroad and study architecture in France. That was very common. And that's also why the reason that the role of France and of the UK as well influenced so much, and it came up later during the Soviet period because people that were intelligent had already visited all the different sites and approaches abroad. I hope I answered to your question. And you had also an urban planning institution. What about the roads? It's quite clear for us that we are in charge to maintain the roads of our city gardens. The municipality does not pay for maintaining our roads, but there's a problem because when you walk next to the city garden, there's too much traffic, and we were asking ourselves, should we not destroy the wall and make the street larger so that we have a lane for pedestrians and for bicycles? But that's something that we try to negotiate with the city hall in order to make traveling and transportation easier, because we don't want too much noise as well. So we are permanently discussing between our own budget with our city gardens and the organizations like City Hall that is around and a base of leisure. And usually our communication is very well because we are near the city center and they support us and we support them. We're tolerant both ways. Maybe last question. I would like to make a comment. We have the problems of the cars because it's a problem of any city downtown, and students as well would like to have their own car and drive around. But some use only public transportation. But in Vilnius, more and more people use common transportation, public transportation. It's developed and developing, as well as the uses of bicycle. We have pedestrian lanes, and many people live at the frontier of the city, and they still want to have their own parking lot in front of their house. But that's no more so in fashion that it used to be. Last question? No last questions? Maybe the last question. What is, do you have support of the people, of institutions, of the city gardens? What is the support that you have from the people? We showed several examples, but generally speaking, for the campus, there is lodging for students mainly in that area. But in some campus, we have a real estate that has been with a lessor or with individual owners. So you can see in several areas that there are central buildings that date from the period of the manoir. And these central buildings are owned by the city hall. But there are several other buildings and apartments that are privatized. And in Uknaice, everything is privatized because the private houses where the people used to live before, they bought these houses, and we do not see any more a problem in this area. And there is an organization of management to learn how to be together. It's very interesting to see the planification, to see how people are concerned by these networks of transportation. Thank you very much. Lots of questions. Before the lunch break, first of all, thanks a lot to the technical staff and for the YouTube diffusion. We have some technical information as well. Let's see if you have taken the headsets for the translation, please bring them back, and we're going to clean them and disinfect them. We invite you all to take a common picture of all the participants and of the public outside the theater. After that, if you wish it, we can visit this garden city. I imagine it's about half an hour long after the picture. During the whole time of our break, the apartment that is behind the theater is open. You can go and visit and see our local heritage if you wish so. And during the visit, you can also exceptionally be able to see the swimming pool of Henri Sellier. You have the buffet, which is only for the speakers on the ground floor. And I remind you that everything is filmed and it's sent to YouTube, and you can see it in French and in English in replay. So may we remind you, if you ask questions, please, you are filmed. If you don't want that your image will be published, you have to say that to the cameraman and the technical team. We can find this document in the entrance, and you can give it at signed if you don't want to appear in the videos. Enjoy your lunch break. 2:15. That makes a bit more than an hour. Thank you very much.